So that's enough fun. So we've had a fun presentation. It's now me. So sorry about that. Also, quick apology if people have heard me speak on some of this stuff recently. I will use some content I've used before, but kind of context is everything. So I will hopefully talk about some slightly different things than I have done before. I'm going to start by talking a bit about safety. I don't mean this to be a particularly industry bashing session, which it perhaps can sound, but I just want to paint a picture about some of the things we see, perhaps how the problems can look from a slightly outside view, and then talk about some of the opportunities, talk about what the future could look like. Because actually, and we don't always talk about this that much in DVSA, but our job is to help industry succeed. In government, our job isn't just about regulating, stopping people doing things, making things difficult. It might sometimes feel like it's that, but actually our job is to make industry, society succeed. It's to help growth. It's to help promote growth. As I say, I know it might not always feel like it, but that is part of why we're here. So we got to be part of that solution to making things succeed. I will have talked about this this slide in quite a few forums, and it might seem slightly boring, but essentially this shows the prohibition rate that we see at the roadside compared to how long a vehicle has had its MOT, or how long since it's had its MOT. Now, what you might expect if vehicles were maintained consistently all through the year, I suppose either you'd expect there not to be a prohibition rate, or you'd expect that prohibition rate to be broadly constant. But what it shows is that shortly after an MOT, a vehicle isn't very likely to get a prohibition, but a little while after an MOT, a vehicle is fairly likely to get a prohibition. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that vehicles aren't consistently maintained through the year. Well, not all vehicles are consistently maintained throughout the year. And of course, you know, that is something we see sometimes when we do our investigations. We'll look through an operator's records when we've seen that there's a problem, and what you'll find is a big stack of invoices shortly before the MOT, in terms of that very heavy prep that gets the vehicle up to the minimum standard. Up to the minimum standard? That sounds an odd phrase, doesn't it? And then you perhaps don't see as many invoices for the rest of the year. So that's always a picture that worries me. And sadly, that picture doesn't change very much. It's pretty much a constant, whether we looked at that today, whether we looked at that 5 years ago, or maybe looked at it 10 years ago. Okay, a few more statistics, and then we'll move on to talking about people. A couple of other things we see. So we do something called the Fleet Compliance Survey, and broadly speaking, that is, rather than us doing targeted enforcement, we sort of randomly stop trucks, buses, coaches, to just see what the underlying levels of compliance are. So we're not targeting, we're just seeing on a day, what do things look like on the road? And what that data tells us is 14%. So by my dubious maths, I think that's about 1 in 7. That tells us that at any point, 1 in 7 heavy vehicles, so trucks, buses, coaches, is non-compliant at any one point. Is that the thing we want for our industry? Is that the thing we want for the public to see in our industry? That at any one point, a truck has got a brake not working, a wheel nut loose, whatever it might be. It's probably not the picture we want for our industry. Similarly, at annual test, after all of that effort has gone into bringing vehicles up to that minimum standard, we get around 1 in 10 vehicles fail that annual test. And just as a related point, when we do target enforcement, when we do try and look after the trucks that are most likely to have got things wrong with them, we get to about 1 in 3 of them having something wrong with them. Again, they're probably not the pictures we want for our industry. I'll move on from this kind of vein of thinking in a second, but another area I've been looking at is something called the road safety strategy. So I don't know how many people are avid readers of what gets published on gov.uk. I imagine 1 or 2 of you are. But just before Christmas, I think it was just before Christmas, as a gift to the country, the government published something called the Road Safety Strategy. And that talks about various things that government are going to do or are doing to improve road safety. What it also does is it highlights some perspectives on the problem that the government is trying to solve. And I'll just mention a couple of them. One of them is, and I used to proudly quote this in international forums about Britain having the safest roads in the world. And by kind of however you measured those statistics about killed and seriously injured by numbers of kilometres driven or numbers of miles driven on the road or numbers of vehicles on the road, whatever of those measures you used, Britain, along with Sweden actually, tended to come out top. Now, if you look at those statistics, we aren't the top. And that's a shame, isn't it? Because we could be so much better, because we have been so much better. Now, and again, it depends exactly how you look at those statistics, we're 4th, 5th, 6th, somewhere in that list. And that's not necessarily because Britain's become any worse, but that's because other countries have become a whole lot better. So particularly some of those Eastern, Western European countries that have got perhaps quite different infrastructures, they've overtaken us. They've become better at road safety. And, you know, without wishing to state the obvious, road safety is really important, isn't it? We don't want to be inadvertently killing people, maiming people, etc. That's why road safety is important. So wouldn't it be great if we could get back up that leaderboard? Another point that the strategy mentions is it talks a lot about hierarchy of road users. And I'm not going to bang on about that, but, and I'll probably get these statistics slightly wrong, but what it tells us is that bigger vehicles present bigger risks. It doesn't necessarily say that they cause all of those accidents, but of all those collisions that do kill or seriously injure people, there is a greater chance of big vehicles, e.g. HGVs, PSVs, being involved in those collisions and therefore killing, injuring someone, than you would expect for the number of them on the road and the number of miles that they drive. Now, as an engineer, that perhaps doesn't seem that surprising because they're pretty big. They don't move much when things hit them. They keep going when they try and slow up. But again, it's not something that I think this industry wants to be a statistic we talk about. Wouldn't it be great if, as an industry, we were able to say, actually, when it comes to those unfortunate killed and seriously injured, actually the chances of that being with a heavy vehicle are really small. Just to clarify what I'm saying, I'm not saying that means it's always HGV, PSV operators' fault. Because often it isn't. Sometimes car drivers, cyclists, pedestrians do things that we might consider silly, foolish, reckless, and end up getting themselves killed or seriously injured. But again, as an industry, as government within that industry, wouldn't it be great if we could do more to help educate those car drivers, motorists, pedestrians to not do those silly things that end up getting themselves killed, to understand what interacting with trucks, buses, coaches needs to look like to better avoid the risk of killing yourself. So I won't bang on about it. I guess the point is there's a lot to do. There's more that can be done. We shouldn't rest on our laurels. We shouldn't be complacent when it comes to safety. Safety is really important. None of us will want those things to happen to our families, to our friends, etc. And of course, because those numbers are relatively high, it means there's a fair chance of that happening. So as an industry, we need to keep it at the forefront of our minds. This is a fun slide to explain, and I'm not going to mercifully explain it in absolute detail, but for those people who have read the road safety strategy, it talks a lot about safe systems, and this is a term that government use. These are some headings that government use, and as I say, I'm not going to read them out in absolute detail, but these headings, so thinking about vehicles, thinking about the speed vehicles go at, thinking about road users, be they drivers, be they pedestrians, be they cyclists, be they motorists, thinking about the roads themselves and thinking about how we respond to when things do go wrong, those 5 headings are quite helpful headings to have in mind as a vehicle operator for some of the systems you need to have to help keep yourself safe, and your operations safe, and those who interact with your operations safe. And I'm not saying you absolutely need to structure all of your systems around exactly those 5 headings, but challenging yourself as to whether you do think about those headings and whether your systems are wholly effective is quite a good thing. Because actually, if we get all of those things right, and we are thinking about, well, how safe are our vehicles? How safe is the speed our vehicles are going? How safe are our people who are mending our trucks, who are driving our trucks, who are interacting with our trucks? Do we understand the roads we're using? Do we accommodate that in the systems that we have? Do we think about whether our vehicles are sometimes off-road and more likely to get cut tyres, etc., etc.? Do we think about how we would react to when things do go wrong? Do our drivers know what to do if they should be involved in a collision? How to help other road users who may have been involved in that? All those sorts of things are parts of a safe system. And if we can all have more effective safe systems, we can help reduce the numbers of killed and seriously injured people. Now, unbelievably, despite not having planned how these different sessions would fit together, there is a link to the previous presentation. The link obviously isn't been entertaining because we've established that the previous session was entertaining and this one isn't. What all of those systems have in common is that they're all heavily dependent on people. And one thing I think we see in DVSA, and one thing actually that most industries see, is that when systems don't work, it isn't normally the failing of the piece of paper or the failing of the computer system. It's about the people who are using those systems and whether the people are motivated to use that system, whether they understand that system, whether they see the value of that system. And I think there was an example used earlier about, driver walk-around checks. But, it's worth challenging ourselves. We all talk about drivers' walk-around checks. We all have checklists that drivers do and religiously file them in a place. But do drivers see the action that follows? Do drivers have the confidence to raise an issue when they see an issue with a vehicle and know that actually it's going to be okay? If they've said they're not taking a vehicle out the yard because there's something wrong with it, that actually that's okay. That's the right outcome. The safety culture is such that actually that overrides all the other factors. And that point about safety culture, I think, is really important. I think, we do increasingly see it in a lot of operators, that really robust safety culture where everybody cares about safety. But we don't see it in every operator. If you think, I saw something in the press recently about, this might sound like a digression, but it was about in the airline industry. And it was about how someone relatively junior, I think, in something to do with filling a piece of paper in that sort of says the gangway can go to the plane or something. But what they noticed was, as the pilot had got onto the plane, that the pilot smelt of booze. And they'd done something about it. And I guess to me, that kind of way of working, that fact that everybody involved in getting that plane into the air was part of that safety culture. And the fact that that person, their job was actually just wheeling a ladder to the plane or whatever it was, and there's this very senior pilot here who was briskly marching onto the plane, they didn't hesitate to raise that point. And as I say, we do see that culture in some operators, but perhaps it isn't there in every operator. Does everybody see their job as having safety at the forefront of being the thing that everyone will raise? So this was my kind of summary of what perhaps being fit for the future needs to look like. And actually, I'll sort of start with the bottom, which is getting into further innuendo, I realise. But the one I've talked about already is that human factors. Actually, part of the future of our industry is the people we have in our industry. That's making sure that we reward people correctly in the industry, we make it an attractive industry to work in. Absolutely, the industry needs to be competitive, but it also needs to compete for people. And it can sometimes feel like we're not able to. We're part of that industry. We struggle with it as well. We struggle to recruit the right people to test vehicles. We struggle with the right people to inspect vehicles. Our pay is fairly heavily constrained. therefore we struggle to compete. But we know the whole industry struggles to compete. So we need to think about that. For the future of our industry, has to be an industry that people want to work in. So our job, and that includes us, we need to make it an industry that people want to work in, that they feel it's a valued job. We need to think about the basics. A lot of what I talked about isn't that clever, really. It's the basics. It's the basics that we all know, actually. I doubt there's anything I've said that people have gone, wow, that's groundbreaking. We need to have a system for managing compliance. We all know we need to have systems for managing compliance, but sometimes those systems don't work. Often, they don't work because we don't necessarily have the people trained, we don't have the people valued to make those systems work. But the key thing is, we need to have those basics in place. And I do think there is something about technology. We talked a lot about technology this morning, and I think there's technology in vehicles, but there's also technology in how we manage vehicles. I think, technology will change in ways that we may be slightly cynical of, we may or may not believe different things will happen. As it happens, yesterday I was out with an automated vehicle company in North London. So it's a company, they're really an IT company. They're not what I would call a vehicle industry. They're not Ford, JLR, those types of industry. They're an IT company. But what that IT company are doing is they're creating the ability to drive vehicles without a driver. Now, their focus happens to be taxis, and that happens to be where they're seeing a commercial opportunity. But that tech, it's just a piece of IT. That's probably not how they market it. I think it's probably a bit more to it than just a bit of IT, but that's how I see it. It's just a piece of IT. And it happens that they've got it installed in Ford Mustang Mach-E's at the moment, and they might have had it installed in Jaguar I-Paces, but there's no reason it couldn't be installed in other vehicles. And yes, the configuration of that is thinking about how to stop for a member of the public when they call a taxi, how to get the person in the back of the taxi to not vandalize it and what have you. But actually, those are the relatively simple bits of the IT. The hard bit of the IT is getting the thing to drive and getting the thing to drive broadly like a human. The interesting things from my point of view, actually, in the context of this event are, yes, it's really interesting tech. It will inevitably come into this industry, but the companies behind it aren't what you would see as traditional OEMs, and they're not what you would see as traditional vehicle operators. And those are the people who shake up the market and appear. Thinking back a few years, this is probably a bad example, but would London taxi drivers have envisaged a thing called Uber? Would they have seen that coming? And that's predominantly driven by technology, actually. It's a very different business model to what they were used to. And it's shaken up the market, it's changed the industry. And inevitably that will happen in this industry as well. It'll happen less, or it's less likely to happen, if those already within the industry grab hold of some of these things, give them a go, try different things. So I think technology in terms of vehicles is really exciting. It's also really exciting in terms of how we manage vehicles, how we use data. We've talked about AI already, so I won't kind of come back to AI, but there must be huge opportunities. There must be huge opportunities in thinking about all of that data that we have ourselves, but also that sometimes government has and exists elsewhere, of using that to be able to more efficiently look after our vehicles, maintain our vehicles, schedule our vehicles. All of those things can give that edge that will help the industry succeed in the future. So I think, I would advocate grabbing hold of those things and trying them. I've got one more slide, which actually I won't drone on about because I've got 4 seconds left approximately. But one thing DVSA does try to do, whether we do it well or not, is we try and be quite open with our data. We try and share our data as much as possible to allow industry to use it for its own good purposes. Because in some ways, it's not our data, it's the public's data. We're here for the public. So we do quite a lot of that stuff already. I've listed a few of them on here. I'm always interested to hear what other opportunities there are, what other stuff that you may know we've got, you may think we've got, that we could put into the public domain to help industry be efficient, to help give more data for AI to use to make industry more efficient, make it safer. So I think there really is a bright future for the industry. I didn't mean to start on a kind of depressing tone, but it's kind of always worth setting the context of there is so much more we can do, and there's so much more we should do, but it's all an opportunity. So that was it for me. Thank you very much.